Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Commission's April webinar series on the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. My name is Vanessa Cooper, and I'm the Manager of the Health and Medical Research team here at the Commission, which is the team responsible for supporting implementation of the governance framework. So before we begin this afternoon, in the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to provide an acknowledgement of country. For us at the Commission, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet today, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here with us today, and to the lands on which you all join us from. So before we get into day 2 and hear from our speakers, let's address some housekeeping. We have a large volume of people joining us online, so please mute your microphones and use the chat function to seek technical help or to direct questions to any of the presenters online today. And because of the high attendance, as usual, the format of these webinars will feature a closed Q&A session. However, we still encourage you to leave any questions via the chat, and while they'll not be answered live, they will be incorporated into future resources the Commission will release. So please leave any questions, comments or reflections in the chat. And lastly, evaluation and quality improvement are important to us, so please take the time to complete the feedback survey that will be circulated at the end of each webinar, as it will enable the Commission to better support implementation of the governance framework across the maturity scale period. So just quickly, for those of you who joined us yesterday, this webinar series is a 2-part event, and following feedback from our past webinars, day 1 focused on the process of assessment and available resources. Key themes we heard from the morning included the need for health services and assessor agencies to work together ahead of accreditation to prepare plans for assessment, informed by the results of their self-assessment and gap analysis against actions of the governance framework, the value of appropriate expertise during assessment proceedings, along with the availability and review of evidence to justify maturity scale ratings. And finally, how these concepts are underpinned by an established culture of governance for the delivery of clinical trials at senior leadership levels of the health service. We also received a presentation from an experienced assessor to set expectations about the process of assessment, and I provided an outline of the resources underway by the Commission to support implementation of the governance framework. The theme for today is exemplar assessments in practice, and we are fortunate enough to have members from the health service organisations joining us today who represent various roles and responsibilities of the clinical trial workforce, such as those with clinical and corporate expertise from the research executive and governance units. And they have all generously donated their time to share their experience with implementing the governance framework within their local operating context. So Townsville Hospital and Health Service and Sydney Local Health District are each large public health organisations who've been involved in a short notice assessment of their clinical trial service against the governance framework. And both of these assessments have occurred alongside the health service's routine assessment to the NSQHS standards. And their success has been attributed to establishing a strong multidisciplinary culture of clinical trials governance across all levels of the organisation. Sydney Local Health District is also another health organisation who participated in the pilot program for the governance framework back in 2020 and 2021, which supported them to undertake a comprehensive self-assessment and gap analysis of their clinical trial service against the safety and quality actions of the governance framework to prepare for accreditation. While Townsville's clinical trial service supports a large metropolitan and regional geography that encompasses a diverse patient population, and because of this, they also operate decentralised clinical trials models of care, particularly in the form of teletrials. And due to this, we have invited a presentation from key experts in the field of teletrials to talk about their experience operationalising these models, not only in the context of Townsville, but also the work undertaken more broadly in partnership with the Australian Teletrials program to support the sector enhance equity of access for clinical trials and to prepare health services delivering these models with the assessment process. So first up, we'll hear from Peter Westwood, Manager at the Townsville Institute of Health Research and Innovation, to talk about the preparatory work undertaken by the Health Service in advance of assessment to the governance framework, along with the actual process of assessment, identifying related challenges and opportunities. Thank you, Peter.
Hi everyone, my name is Peter Westwood. I'm the Manager for Research for the Townsville Hospital and Health Service. Talking to you today about our experience with the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework assessment process, but also looking at some of the barriers and opportunities I think it's worthwhile pointing out that still exist with respect to offering clinical trials. If I can start with paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which we're all joining this meeting. For me here in Townsville, it's the Bindal and Wulgurukaba people. So a little bit about us. The Townsville Hospital and Health Service, located in northern Queensland, serves an immediate population of around 250,000 people. We operate out of 21 facilities, including the Townsville University Hospital, which is the largest tertiary hospital in Northern Australia. And that hospital provides tertiary services to quite a large catchment, which extends south to around Mackay, west to the Northern Territory border, and north to the Torres Strait. At any one time, we've got about 100 trials open, about half in cancer and about half in other disciplines. And we're very keen to collaborate closely with particularly with our Northern Queensland colleagues and get trials up that are going to be of benefit to the communities across our region more broadly. So our assessment happened in September last year, and I was just going to run through some of the key areas of focus that our reviewers picked up. So the reviewers wanted to know that we had governance structures in place, that we had a mechanism for reporting to our board, and all the committees that were responsible for being a part of the clinical trial reporting framework knew that they were a part of that framework, and it was included within their terms of reference. They wanted to see that we had a policy and procedural framework in place, including one that referenced national and international standards. They wanted to see that we had strategies that articulated our engagement in trials and that linked to our jurisdictional Queensland strategies, as well as to national strategies around expanding access to trials. They wanted to see that our staff were trained and were aware of their responsibilities in delivering trials, that we had a register to manage currency of good clinical practice certification. And the review team did speak with a number of staff when they were here just to confirm that they were aware of their responsibilities. They wanted to see we had a mechanism for collecting and reporting on trial activity that allowed that mandatory quarterly reporting and that addressed the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework performance measures, those 8 mandatory performance measures that are outlined in the framework. And they wanted to see, they wanted to review trial records when they were here. They wanted to make sure, obviously, they were stored appropriately, that consents were in place, that the people on the delegation list were appropriately trained, that staff who had access to trial materials should have access to it. They were also interested in consumer engagement and involvement in trials beyond just involvement as participants. And for a lot of trials, particularly the international pharma-led trials, that's hard because consumers, quite often the materials that we get are the materials we're provided by the sponsor, and local consumer engagement in trying to tailor those materials isn't something we can readily offer, but certainly for local trials, we can look to do that. How do we promote our trials? How do we make sure that the people in our communities know the trial opportunities that are available here? They were very keen on our engagement with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Townsville. Our catchment has about a 9% population of people who are First Nations Indigenous. And they were keen to understand how we were engaging those communities in oversight committees, in participant recruitment, staffing. How were we making our environments culturally safe and our trial materials culturally relevant? They wanted to see that we had an organisational level risk register for the higher level things. This is in addition to the day-to-day trial specific events that might occur. So did we have an ongoing risk register that was then addressed? And did we have a system in place for monitoring and auditing? So look, in summary, our assessment process we found was really positive. It was collegial, it was professional, the team were focused on working with us. It was less a a rigid assessment, more a collegial process of let's see what's needed in order to get to that level of maturity. So the lessons that we learned from our preparation process: start early. We're all busy, and it's easy to push this back to next month, next year. It will take longer than you think to work through the requirements of the framework, and the maturity approach really is a gift. The fact that we've got 3 years less now in order to get maturity before a pass-fail accreditation kicks in is something that we should be valuing and using wisely. Ensure your senior management are engaged, and I would have thought that if your organisation wants to be involved in clinical trials, then that should be motivation for senior management to be involved in this process, but you are going to need senior management buy-in. Conduct gap analysis. So there is a good resource on the Council's clinical trials portal page, the self-assessment tool, and that leads you through all of the various areas of focus of the framework, things that you need to make sure that you've addressed, and provides examples of the sorts of evidence that you'll need to be able to show that you've met the standards. Out of that gap analysis, create an action plan, assign responsibilities, timeframes to addressing those gaps, and regularly meet to revisit your progress on that. And establish your community governance structure early and have that group then be a part of the decision making around things like what data does your organisation want to receive through its quarterly report, in addition to the mandatory 8 measures that the framework requires. And lastly, consider a mock audit. And funnily enough, we were considering a mock audit the week that our actual accreditation was called. So we didn't actually go ahead with that. We had the real thing. So our challenges with respect to the assessment, we're operating across a large footprint. Many of you will be as well. Capturing data for clinical trials to enable our reporting on a quarterly basis. When we've got staff who are distributed, we've got staff who are involved with other organisations, for instance, universities. What mechanism can we put in place to make sure that we've got an easy way of collecting that quarterly data to make sure that we can report accurately? So we've established a REDCap database. We've got nominated staff with roles in that. New trials are added at the point of governance authorisation by the governance team in Townsville, and then individual clinical research coordinators who are responsible for each trial have access to their trials in that database and update their data quarterly. We had a challenge with respect to we call it a 2-speed clinical trial portfolio. So we've got a very well-established, very mature portfolio of cancer trials, less developed in other disciplines. And so what we had to do then was to leverage off those systems in place in oncology and use that to try and roll out processes and approaches across the whole service. The short notice assessment is a challenge for many of us. It's in part it's a positive in that you don't get to dwell and stress on what's going to happen in the accreditation process. Look at the approach we took. We were open with our staff. We made sure that they had input into how we should be approaching the meeting the framework requirements. And on notice of the assessment, we communicated with staff what they might expect and just encouraged them to be open and honest in the process and trust them. We weren't entirely clear what the review team wanted to see, but we were able to work with them at the time and clarify that when they were with us. So the next part of the presentation, I really wanted to look at some of the opportunities and the barriers that are still addressing clinical trials, particularly for regional, rural and remote areas. And this really is a health equity thing. If we can't offer the same opportunities to access trials to our people outside of the major metropolitan centres, then I think we're doing a disservice to those communities. And look, the real stories on the ground really do matter. I guess I'll preface this with the comment that many regional, rural and remote health services have staff capacity that is seriously limited. And so rigid requirements around things like governance can stand in the way of their ability to put trials in place for their patients. There's not an insignificant amount of work that's needed to get a trial up or a teletrial up in a site. That includes things like ethics, a full governance application, a subcontract, a supervision plan, TGA notification potentially, site visit by the sponsor. All of these things take a lot of time and a lot of energy, and for staff who are sort of working day to day and managing the clinical load that they have, sometimes that's insurmountable. So look, I just want to run through a few stories about areas where there's been probably some unintended but regrettable consequences of the current system, and how that's meant that in some cases, some of the patients in our regional, rural and remote communities have not been able to access trials in the way that others might. So we were collaborating with Cooktown Health Service about a year ago with a cancer patient. We wanted to get a local consult up there for a particular patient who lived in Cooktown. So really the consult only consisted of a set of vital signs and a telehealth consult that was being run out of Townsville. So the regulatory, the administrative requirements that were needed to set that site up as a telehealth site, despite our best efforts, was just too much for the local team there. As a result, the patient didn't join the trial and ended up driving to Cairns to seek alternative treatment. We have a situation currently where a cancer patient who lives in Mackay is required to travel to Townsville to receive standard of care consultations. So that's physical assessment, vital signs, and dispensing of PBS approved, funded, non-sponsor, non-trial medications. Currently, the patient has to either drive 4.5 to 5 hours each way or fly from Mackay to Townsville to have that standard of care consultation by the same clinician who they would be seeing in Mackay. Mackay doesn't have a haematology clinic at the moment, so that clinic is delivered every Monday from Mackay by the Townsville clinicians who fly down. So currently, unless we were to set up Mackay as a satellite site, which would require all of that list of regulatory requirements that I outlined before, when Mackay has no involvement apart from providing a room in this trial, if we don't do that, the patient will be required to travel, and currently that's the case. Now, luckily, we have a sponsor who's trying to work with us to find a way forward on this, but currently the situation is either we have to work through all of those onerous regulatory requirements, or the patient will travel, and some of the sort of the unintended but ludicrous outcomes really are that if we were to put in place a teletrial arrangement, the supervision plan would involve our clinicians supervising themselves. The subcontract would involve our health service having a subcontract with ourselves. So, things that don't make any sense, but that's what the system would require if we were to go through that full setup of a teletrial site. We've got a Serena farmer on a cancer trial who was permitted access to some mobile nursing support at home for some of his trial activity, bloods and some study visits and teletrial consults. He lives quite close to the Mackay Base Hospital, about 30 minutes away from the Mackay Base Hospital. But Mackay didn't have the staff capacity to be able to set up a full satellite site for that patient. However, the sponsor was able to arrange an agency nurse on the back of simply a patient consent. So we've got two requirements. Either we set Mackay up as a satellite site, full governance and ethics requirements to set up, or else the sponsor can engage an agency nurse and achieve the same thing. And really, the Mackay Hospital people are incredibly capable and probably would be the better option for this patient to receive these services through. A couple of others. We've got a farmer from a Cape York cattle station regularly receives telehealth care in Atherton. But for his trial consultations, which are incredibly similar to the consultations he receives outside of his trial, he has to travel to Townsville. And we've got a Mackay cancer patient just starting off on their treatment. They're going to be required to fly to Townsville every 3 weeks for 2 years to receive a very safe 30-minute infusion that's already routinely stocked and administered to cancer patients in Mackay. So generally, the trial staff, their approach is that they will try to adhere to the guidelines strictly because they don't want to be found to have committed a breach. The result being it's the patient generally that has to travel. The patient has to be put out, and we're not really doing the best service that we can by the patient. On that, one final example, Tropical Cyclone Kirrily made landfall in Townsville in January 2024, and our trial team received protocol deviations because patients weren't able to get to the hospital to give bloods or receive medications. So going forward, look, we've got exceptional capabilities outside of our major metropolitan centres to deliver trials. And if we're going to continue to improve patient safety and quality, we've got to be open to evolving our framework and being open to looking at those regulatory requirements to make it easier for patients and for clinicians to be able to provide trials to people where they live. There's a role for many of the organisations that are responsible for determining our regulatory requirements to work together. What we'd ask is how are these groups working to ensure access to trials for regional, rural and remote communities? And I think that the framework is a useful first step towards improving quality and ensuring quality in trial delivery by healthcare providers. But not all of the challenges that we're facing can be resolved by the healthcare agencies alone. The measures that we've got in the framework are very much around the regulatory approval timelines, things like how long did your ethics and your governance take. What we're not capturing at the moment is what trials didn't go ahead because the regulatory requirements were too burdensome, and so the patient then either missed out or had to travel. So really, my final comment, without further work by other stakeholders across the whole clinical trial system, we're not going to achieve the outcomes that we should be in improving patient safety, quality and equity. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Some excellent learnings to support the sector prepare operational plans for assessment and demonstrates the comprehensive work undertaken by the Health Service under a collaborative and proactive model to integrate actions of the governance framework into routine service delivery, along with setting expectations about the process of assessment. Next, and on a related note to Townsville's presentation, we will move to Melanie Poxton, Assistant Director of Nursing for the Australian Teletrials Program in Queensland, and Jhodie Duncan, General Manager, Research and Partnerships at Latrobe Regional Health, to each share their comprehensive work they have undertaken within their respective health services who deliver decentralised clinical trials, particularly teletrials, and the process to prepare plans for assessment. Thank you, Mel and Jhodie.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present today at the webinar for the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework on behalf of the Australian Commission for Healthcare Standards. Today, there's two of us presenting. I'm Melanie Poxton, the Assistant Director of Nursing of the Queensland Regional Clinical Trial Coordinating Centre as part of the Australian Teletrial Programme, and Jhodie Duncan is doing Standard 2, and she'll introduce herself later. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. So we would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners, claimants and custodians of the land where we are all living and working today. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, past and present, and recognise their cultures, histories and diversity and their deep connection to the lands, waters and seas. Why do we need to use decentralised clinical trials? And what's the value of the Australian Teletrial Programme, and how does it fit in to what I'm just going to call DCTs this afternoon? So here are some distances, and this is what makes Australia unique along with some other really large countries or continents. So you see distances there on the maps, and these are the distances that sometimes patients have to travel, especially Australians that live in regional, rural and remote areas. And what do we know about them and their health? Well, we know that they have shorter lives, considerably shorter lives, anything from 10 to 20 and even more years that they lose of their life due to being unable to access health services appropriately. They have higher levels of disease and injury. They have poorer access, as we've just discussed, to and the use of health services, which are generally largely based in the metropolitan areas. They do face barriers taking part in clinical trials. We have cultural differences in Australia, so having mechanisms by which we can offer rural, regional and remote people access to clinical trials is a really good positive for the sponsors because of our access to cultural diversity, but we have to make that happen. And we have the geographical isolation, and we all know about that, especially the ones of us that live in the regions. So there's things that we can do, and today we're going to discuss what they are. So I've just given a brief summary of what decentralised clinical trials are and what teletrials are and how I believe they complement each other. So the first teletrial in Australia was run in 2018, and that happened to be the first teletrial in the world. And that focuses on clusters. It enables sites to develop and expand their reach in the clinical trial setting. You can bring on trial naive sites that can receive support from more experienced sites through the cluster formations. And there's a primary site, and they can have a number of satellite sites. There's one principal investigator in a cluster, and we need to assess what the sites can perform in terms of study tasks. It has to be within their site capability. If we can do that and deliver it safely, valid and reliable, then this in turn reduces the need for patients to travel long distances just to be able to access the clinical trial. It mainly focuses on sites, reducing patient travel, treatments that can be done at the satellite sites and where they have the capacity to do so, that should happen. We're enabling more trial naive sites using the cluster model, and we'll improve the number of clinical trial sites in Australia. And we're improving access to diversity in clinical trials by reaching out to rural and remote populations that have a higher First Nations population within them as well, and to the communities. Decentralised trials or hybrid trials, this has really come to the fore post-COVID, where we had to look at how we were running clinical trials during the pandemic. It has been around for a lot longer than teletrials, but now teletrials are recognised as one of the methodologies within decentralised clinical trials. Sponsors had been outsourcing study tasks for a long time. They might use web-based drug allocation systems, electronic data collection, and a trial can be called a DCT if it's just that participants are using electronic quality of life or drug diaries. It does not generally use additional sites. They can use telehealth, the same that we can use telehealth in teletrials as well. Sponsors may do direct-to-patient drug delivery, and patients may still need to travel to site for some treatments or assessments. And they may be more common for commercially sponsored trials. But I guess if you're doing a decentralised trial and you're working with people more remotely, then having teletrials as part of your methodology provides the safety mechanism of wherever that patient lives. So a good reason to combine the two. So a little bit more about why we use DCTs and ATP teletrial methodology. I'm mainly going to cover Australian teletrial program in this section, but I have made reference to a publication that was done in 2024 about how to implement decentralised clinical trials through teletrials and where to from here. So what have the Australian teletrial program done? It's established regional clinical trial coordinating centres in 6 of the states and territories, excluding New South Wales and ACT at this point, but we do partner with them informally and work across and share resources. We've been educating and providing training for the workforce. We've been doing capacity building, building capability at sites. Through the Medical Research Future Fund grant that we work under, we've been providing equipment and logistics resourcing to sites. And we've been looking at how can we recruit more patients to clinical trials using teletrials, and working with sponsors about what do we need to change in the system, and also working across the country at policy harmonisation to make sure that where we make changes, they're relevant for everyone so that more patients can have access. This is a visual of what the teletrial model looks like. It's a teletrial cluster where primary and satellite sites are connected, and they determine which activities are safe at each site. And I think Jhodie will probably show this slide later as how it relates to patients. But what I wanted to do was look at the primary site, and you can see with the icons attached to the primary site how many activities they can undertake. And then at each of the satellite sites, you can see that they may be able to undertake less activities, but they can at least complete some of the activities, if not all of them. And that is the basis of the teletrial model. Now, if you can run a clinical trial, you can conduct a teletrial. And this is one of the slides that lots of people like. I call it myth busting, but it's about the 4 points of difference that you need to make when you conduct a teletrial compared to a clinical trial. So clinical trials are conducted under the teletrial model. They must comply with the national principles for teletrials in Australia and the national standard operating procedures for clinical trials, which includes teletrials. 4 additional documents that are published and available for use in the teletrial model. There's an ethics letter on the Australian Teletrial Programme website, which describes to the ethics committees what the model is about, and you are more than welcome to give them a supervision plan template off that same website. There's a supervision plan which becomes a governance document. It's where the PI, the principal investigator of each primary site, will document exactly how they are going to oversight the satellite sites within a cluster. And that could look different for each one based on their capability and capacity. This is a key document to the Australian Teletrial Programme because it documents the collaboration and the communication, the safety, the reporting, the means of communication between a primary site and one or more of its satellite sites. There needs to be a different contract arrangement because the sponsor will only have the main clinical trial research agreement, CTRA, with the primary site. So the primary site will then need to bind itself to the satellite sites. And usually this is in the form of a subcontract. Again, that is published on the Australian Teletrial Programme website. And there's actually additional wording for both the protocol and the master consent form that we've worked on with sponsors to be able to provide, because we do believe that if we put wording around the methodology into the protocols from protocol development, it does help both the ethics committees and everyone else to actually understand what the teletrial methodology is and why we should be using it. This is a busy slide, but I just wanted to spend a minute or two explaining what your RCCCs in each of the states and territories are there for and what we're intending to do. So this is the Queensland Regional Clinical Trial Coordinating Centre that I lead. So what's our vision? It's closing the gap in health outcomes for all Queenslanders by building a more interconnected clinical trial system. The model of care is using the Australasian teletrial model. We create trial clusters by linking a primary site to one or more satellite sites. And what's the purpose? The whole purpose is around patients. It's around patients having access to clinical trials closer to home, regardless of geographic location. So we believe the regional clinical trial coordinating centres are critical to the uptake of clinical trials using the teletrial model and have the expertise to be able to help the clinical teams deliver teletrials wherever they're located. There's been extensive engagement across all of the RCCCs, but I can speak for Queensland with our hospital and health services. We provide on-site mentoring and supervision. We've developed a clinical research coordinated teletrial network for education and workforce capacity building. There is some grant funding available for equipment and logistics. It is an enabling infrastructure grant, so we have worked and provided some infrastructure development within the hospital and health services. Clusters allow rural, regional and remote patients to have equity and access to a clinical trial, and there is some Australian Teletrial Programme support funding to the eligible primary and satellite sites that recruit patients. The QRCCC is part of the Australian Teletrial Programme and works with all jurisdictions to ensure uptake of the model and policy harmonisation across Australia. So in the white oval shapes is really how the teletrials and DCTs work together and what the RCCC's purpose is in delivering teletrials. So we will assess site capacity to make sure they can be included in the proposed clinical trial. We'll determine which of the activities they can undertake. We'll help to gain the ethics approval and add the satellite sites. And we'll provide exemplars of a supervision plan, consent forms, protocol-specific wording, and detailed ethics letters. Once ethics approval is gained, we'll help submit both to the primary site, Research Governance Office, and to the satellite site. We'll help with the logistics of the supervision plan and determine what activity can be undertaken where. We will ask the question, does the sponsor support one of the elements of decentralised clinical trials like direct-to-patient delivery of drug? Or is there a central pharmacy model? Or does the QRCCC itself need to support via courier fees in order that patients that live rural, regional and remote can have access? We will gain all relevant letters of support from the remote locations facility managers, and will provide good clinical practice, curriculum vitae, and IATA for dangerous shipping of goods. We will gain all relevant letters of support from the remote locations facility managers, will provide good clinical practice certification, curriculum vitae, and ensure that everybody is able to have shipping of dangerous goods and have certification for that. And then once the sites are open in the cluster, the primary site will support each of the satellite sites, and the QRCCC or your local RCCC will also support the satellite sites at every stage of activities and with the planning. And we have built in a whole series of resources and templates as well to support with that, as well as training. So how do teletrials differ from decentralised? I thought having a few definitions is really good. The FDA talks about DCTs and says activities occur at locations other than the traditional trial site. They can even be at the participant's home or local healthcare facilities. Teletrials is a subcomponent of a DCT. And we have a range of activities that can be interpreted according to clinicians and sponsors' needs, and we work as a cluster. And what is a cluster? It's a group of sites that work together to conduct clinical trials under the supervision of a primary site. And the primary and satellite sites can use telehealth. They don't always have to communicate. They need to be able to communicate by whatever means, and that's really important, and that needs to be documented. But all of it allows for aspects of clinical trials to be delivered closer to home, and allows patients not only to have access, but also to be retained on trials, because that's the other important thing. Even if they do join a clinical trial, if they can't have some component of care closer to home, they're likely to drop out. So this does actually support keeping retention as well of participants in clinical trials. So what about the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework and its positive impacts on implementation? This is something that we did in Queensland, and we have worked with the Victorians on this as well. So the Clinical Trial Governance Standard 1, the intention is to implement governance for clinical trial services to make sure we can care for patients and consumers safely and deliver high quality clinical trial services. So what we did in Queensland was we prepared a list of every action under Standard 1, and then if they were initial or growing and established, we gave some indications or comments and evidence they could collect against each action. And in that way, that's one way that the RCCCs have supported their hospital and health services with their accreditation processes under the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework. We did the same for Standard 2. Under the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework, we looked at the clinical governance and quality improvement systems and how were they supporting partnering with consumers. And the HHSs or the healthcare facilities were to consider at all levels, the individual, the service, the department, or the programme of care, or across the whole health service to see how well we were doing this in clinical trials. And again, we provided an evidence list and comments about how they might work and what they would set up if they were initial, and how they might reinforce what they were already doing and to meet the standards against the growing and established sites. And again, we looked at the standards and we looked to help them to find processes. If they were initial, what would they need to do right in the beginning to start on this pathway? And if they were growing and established, how could they bolster and reinforce what they were already doing to be able to meet the accreditation standards for Standard 2 partnering with consumers? So is the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework making a difference to the clinical trials landscape? I believe most definitely it is. I think it's a fantastic opportunity. This is something we did with private entities who may not already have governance processes when you're setting them up to do trial activity for the first time. So I looked at regulatory requirements, clinical management processes, and oversight of clinical trial activities at the private institution. And using that process, we have set up private facilities to be very successful in commercially sponsored clinical trials. And then the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework making a difference to the clinical trials landscape. And what do we need to do next? Well, healthcare systems need to embrace the framework and allow and integrate clinical trials to be part of the routine business of health service providers. We need to make sure that we integrate governance systems into clinical trial service provision and clinical trials into delivery of healthcare. It needs to be routine business. Clinical trials should be offered to the people of our respective states and territories. especially where doing so provides a potential better treatment option than the current standard of care. And the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework means that clinical trials must be incorporated into and align with current clinical governance, patient safety reporting, and not be considered anything other than another way to deliver healthcare. And clinical trials, when successful and proven, provide the means of how the whole of Australia can access new treatments, devices, and models that improve health outcomes and drive innovation into practice. And I think as well, and it's not on a slide, there's a great opportunity under the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework to work with the assessors and the accreditation teams to look at how they assess and to ensure that metropolitan sites with their resourcing are actually accredited and assessed against how much support they are providing for their rural, regional and remote patients and their rural, regional and remote health services, because that is vital in this piece of work. And thank you very much for your time. It's been a delight to speak to you, and I hope that we take the National Clinical Trial Governance Framework in the spirit that it's been developed, because it's a really positive thing, I think, in our setting. Thank you.
Well, thank you and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Mel, for a great setting up the first part of this presentation today. My name's Jhodie Duncan. I'm the General Manager of Research and Partnerships from Latrobe Regional Health, and it's a real honour to have this opportunity to talk to the community about our experiences and some of our holistic perspectives, particularly relating to Standard 2 under the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. I just, as Mel did, would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we're on, and here at LIH, this is the Gunno Kurnai and Barragong peoples. Thank you. So Latrobe Regional Hospital is located in Gippsland, and we're located about 160 kilometres east of Melbourne. We're a moderate size regional hospital, so we do have just over 350 beds and 3,000 staff, and we act as Gippsland's specialist referral trauma and mental health centre. And we provide most of the required healthcare provisions, as you would expect for a regional setting, but we provide those to just under 300,000 people across Greater Gippsland. Now, this is why for us the framework is so important and why we really need to work together to get trials into regional areas. So Gippsland residents represent about 4% of the state of Victoria's population, but overall we have a high incidence of chronic disease and poorer outcomes. And you can see just some of the stats there. I'm not going to read through them for you, but the high burden of disease with all your big ticket items, so cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, 107% higher than the state average for respiratory and lung conditions. And a lot of these diseases are complex in nature. So most of our individuals will have comorbidities. And we also have a large multicultural population and a large Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. So these are really important factors that we need to consider when we're thinking about how to implement best care practice and how we provide for our community. And this is the voice we need to listen to when we really want to partner with our consumers to improve healthcare options. So where it began for LRH was really thinking about how do we provide that person-centred care. So where did it all begin? So in 2018, our board and our exec recognised that research needed to be part of our strategic plan. And our research and clinical trials unit was established in 2019. We were structured to an independent unit shortly after, and we had this real centralised model to try to enable transdisciplinary growth while embedding research and clinical trials into the fabric of quality service provision within our organisation. So we've just opened our 42nd trial for the hospital, and we've launched our strategic vision for our research unit. And that is really to focus on working together with our community to improve health outcomes for the Gippsland community. How do we do that? That's listening to our community. Can we provide leadership to our community? How do we improve the access to our community for greater health outcomes? How do we raise the awareness to our community of what their options might be in a healthcare setting? How do we retain really good clinical staff so we can upskill our workforce?
So how do we continue to grow in this space so we can keep providing high standard and quality healthcare outcomes? So to do this, we really needed to look at how we could think outside the box and provide healthcare options that might not fit the norm. So our community, for example, in the whole of Greater Gippsland, so that's that light blue area on the Victorian map there, there's no specialty care for dermatology services. So if you require these, you actually have to go to a metro centre. Now, people think, oh, a bit of eczema. Actually, the quality of life scores for people that have moderate to severe eczema, for as an example, are lower than some of your more heavily considered disease burden conditions. So what we did is we utilised the Teletrial model, and Mel's done a great job explaining that previously, but we partnered with a primary site that had the capacity to undertake all elements of the clinical trial. And we would be a satellite site, so we could provide some elements of care closer to home. So what did that mean for our organisation? We partnered with a metro centre which had a high functioning dermatology unit. We partnered with a commercial sponsor which was very willing to adapt to our capabilities and our needs. And we implemented the Teletrial, so share care model. What did this mean for us? We had access to specialty care in dermatology. We utilised digital technology and telehealth to be able to take elements of that care here at LRH. We were able to upskill some of our staff so they learnt skin scoring techniques, and this meant we improved our capacity. So overall, we formed this beautiful partnership which not only improved our site capability and our overall organisation capability, but importantly, primarily, it enabled us to provide care closer home. And what this meant was we had great consumer engagement. We did a lot of media work around this, and we had people reaching out to us. And if they weren't available for the trial that we could offer, we could refer them to other specialty care needs. So if we're focused on utilising different adaptive trial models to provide care closer to home, does that really translate into an effect? And we know that our community tell us that they don't go on trials in metro centres because of the travel, because of the financial burden, and because of the impact upon their lives when they're already in a state of health compromise. So what we did is we looked at some data, and we presented this at Ghazal last year. And when we looked at this equivalent number of trials that were offered either locally here at LRH or at a metro centre, we saw a 70% increase in uptake onto those trials. So if we can get the trials closer to home, we do see people going onto trial. And it's really important for us to follow now, as Mel mentioned, to really look at whether these people we can retain these people on trial and ultimately hopefully have better outcomes. But how do we think about this in a more global perspective, particularly related to standard 2, so that is partnering with consumers? So we've worked with a lot of different affiliate health organisations across the Greater Gippsland region, so ourselves here right up to the state border. And we've developed a Gippsland clinical trial working group. And this was led in part by the fact that we already have capability to assist with ethics and governance through a centralised repository. What does this mean for our greater organisation across Greater Gippsland? Well, we've come to a unified agreement that we will work together to provide a regional approach to clinical trial uptake across Gippsland. And this means we can implement different shared care and decentralised models to improve clinical trial access closer to home. This means that we can take shared learnings from sites that have potentially already gone through the experiences under the framework and help support some of our more immature sites to grow in capacity. Our ability in our network also provides the opportunity to share information about different trials and what might suit and help support different organisations. This also provides the capacity to share trial information across the network and support trial startup, including a centralised governance process. We've also developed a centralised resource repository, and we continue to try to provide upskilling of local staff so we retain good skills, good healthcare skills in the local region. But importantly, this is all linked to our consumer feedback, the needs of our community care close to home, and we use our local demographics and our links within networks to help develop this capability across the Greater Gippsland region. And we believe the development of this strong partnership with an aligned vision to provide care closer to home will only enhance ability within the Gippsland region to provide clinical care access. So I think Mel addressed this beautifully. The framework to date really has had a positive impact to promote better health outcomes. And operationally, it really addresses the needs of providing and implementing clinical trials into healthcare frameworks. I believe the embedded processes and consolidated approach will only have benefits for a longer term gain and ultimately will support a system to drive change. I think there's great opportunity to work with the Commission because incorporation of decentralised and teletrial models might need further consideration. We know that the implementation of the framework can be resource intense, and we don't want this to impact on small or new emerging sites. But I think we're in an environment where we have a change in culture and a mindset. And if we provide education and awareness and look for leaders within this space that have willingness to advocate of the benefits of the framework, there's a great opportunity to work together to improve outcomes. So what do we look for? Well, ultimately, we're looking for impact. How do we impact and improve our quality of our healthcare? So things such as accreditation across the network and proportional review may enhance the ability for sites to uptake and roll out clinical trials. Assessment and incorporation of multiple models, including decentralised trials and teletrials. Potentially a system that captured metrics and demographics of areas so you can put trials into regions where they're really needed. And maybe the one-stop shop will actually address this. But importantly, whatever's being rolled out, we need to develop infrastructure, particularly within networks, that's going to support this growth of clinical trials. But importantly, implementation needs the voice of the consumer. We need to put our patients first and every day listen to what their needs are. And ultimately, what we do within the health care service needs to be led and informed by our community needs. Ultimately, I think the framework provides a great opportunity, an opportunity to provide safe and high quality patient-centred care, particularly closer to home. And instead of working in silos as we have done for many years, we need to come together and all contribute to part of this bigger vision within the Australian landscape. So I'd just like to say thank you to the Commission, for the audience here today, for Mel with partnering with me for this presentation, and also thank you for everybody for listening today.
Thank you, Mel and Jhodie. I think having you both here today to talk about teletrials and the role of primary and satellite sites and the subsequent approach to accreditation, alongside the work undertaken to partner with consumers to enhance equity for clinical trial access, is extremely useful for the sector, particularly among assessor agencies. And the Commission is in the process of working with the Australian Teletrials program to prepare guidance to the sector regarding decentralised clinical trial models and the process of assessment to the governance framework. So this presentation is an excellent foundation for this work, and hopefully we can share a summary of this project in our next webinar series. So for our final case study, we will now hear from Merela Ghazal, Executive Research Manager at Sydney Local Health District, who participated in the pilot of the governance framework and is fortunate enough to work within a health service that has a strong clinical trials culture that proactively supports effective implementation of the governance framework from the top down. Thank you, Merela.
Hi everyone, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. It's a privilege to share our journey as we prepared for the implementation and assessment of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. And as you know, achieving great results in any accreditation program is never an individual endeavour. There really has been a concerted effort from a large number of people at every level in the organisation, including other health services who underwent accreditation before us and were generous to share their experiences and lessons learned. Before I kick off, I wish to acknowledge that I am hosting this presentation from the lands of the Ghazal and the Wangal people of the Great Eora Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present at this meeting. So my name is Merela Ghazal and I am the Executive Research Manager at the Sydney Local Health District. I am operationally responsible for 3 research support business units, and my role reports to the Director of Research and the Executive Director of Medical Services Risk and Clinical Governance. Today, I want to give you a practical, high-level insight into how we operationalise and scaled our efforts across a large health district. I am an operations manager by background, and so I'm all about systems and processes. As someone who prefers to be in the background listening and making things happen, me talking to you today is a humbling experience. By no means will I be able to cover everything. However, by sharing some of our own experiences and the things we've implemented, we hope you might find it useful in your own health service. Also, just to say, we haven't figured everything out or have mastered what we've implemented. We are, like many others, still on a journey and learning every day. Most of our preparations over the past few years were within the current FTE, and we did not hire additional resources, although I do highly recommend you doing so. So just a bit about a background. I would say that one of the key attributes that has contributed to the success and why we are being considered as an exemplar case study is due to a strong research structure, which formed organically from a deep-rooted research culture in the Sydney Local Health District. By way of background, the Sydney Local Health District has been conducting research since probably before the 1970s. However, the earliest record of a formal clinical trial at Royal Prince Alfred was in 1979, where research commenced into sleep apnea, which was a body of work that was defined as CPAP, which led to the company ResMed. So since 1979, the Sydney Local Health District has undertaken more than 6,000 clinical trials, and there are currently between 700 and 730 clinical trials conducted at one time. Our first ever 5-year research strategic plan was launched in 2012, and we have just finalised our 3rd strategic plan. So there is a vibrant culture and a drive to conduct high quality research, which also means conducting clinical trials at the highest regulatory level. So becoming a pilot site. So for our preparations for the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework, it really did start back in late 2020, when we were selected as a site for the pilot program, which was right in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. So while there was pressure at the time, we didn't want to miss our opportunity. We spent 5 months preparing for the pilot, where we put forward 1 facility, Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, along with 6 active clinical trials to be assessed in early 2021. The efforts and mechanisms that went into preparing for the pilot would be a blueprint and a springboard for how we would prepare for the full accreditation. I would have to say that the pilot program was an eye-opening experience, and although we were awarded as having highly established systems, we knew the biggest challenge for us was ensuring that all the district's 700 plus clinical trials, as well as all of our facilities, and that includes a number of hospitals, community and drug and mental health services, were ready for accreditation and were meeting the 27 actions of Standards 1 and 2. Following the pilot program, or that pilot experience, we developed a detailed post-pilot action plan, which was the key document to guide everything we did from that point forward. The post-pilot action plan led to many key initiatives and achievements being realised, namely the audit preparation tool, some consumer engagement strategies, training and policy development. So as you will notice from the timeline, we really had about 3 years to prepare, which gave us some time to strengthen our current systems, implement new initiatives and scale up efforts to ensure all clinical trials in the district were ready. As you can see here in 2020, I have highlighted gap analysis conducted, because this really is the first step any health service must undergo before they attempt to implement the framework. And just to highlight, the initiatives we focused on and we are most proud of are the development of the audit tool to facilitate self-assessment and gap analysis for facilities and clinical trial units, a dedicated SLHD research intranet developed to support the Clinical Trials Governance Framework with links to the Safety Commission and other key clinical governance resources. Consumer engagement action plan templates were developed and now are a condition of ethics and governance approval. Appointment of consumer representatives and former clinical trial participants to 2 critical committees, the Clinical Trial Steering Committee and the Human Research Ethics Committee. Good clinical practice training and audit-ready face-to-face were offered twice a year and funded by the Research Office. And a PREMS questionnaire was formalised and added to the site-specific participant information sheet and is part of the research ethics and governance approval process. So preparing for short notice. During the pilot program, we had engaged with a number of clinical trial units, so we had a foundation to build from. However, in order to scale up and roll this out across the district, we leveraged key existing forums that had long been established, such as the coordinated network meetings, research and board meetings, and clinical councils. Early and continuous engagement was critical, starting with our clinical trials workforce and our support teams. We have a board at the Sydney Local Health District and a CE and executives who are highly engaged and were supportive from the beginning. We worked really hard to ensure that communication was simple and frequent. We clarified roles and responsibilities and expectations at every level, from investigators to HR, IT, and governance units. We ensured research and clinical trials framework was a standing item on agendas of relevant clinical and research governance committees. I won't dive in too much into evidence gathering, except to say it's important to check with your clinical governance team about the systems they prefer you to use. The SLHD currently uses SharePoint to make evidence readily available. Staff information. We delivered numerous information sessions tailored to the needs of the clinical trial workforce. 7:30 a.m. sessions for the surgeons or clinicians who started their clinics early. Lunchtime and after-hour sessions were offered at other sites. Attendance was strong, and at some sessions we had over 100 staff members join the meeting. And overall, we had more than 200 staff attend the staff information sessions. After each session, we sought feedback, which was used to refine content and delivery for the next session. We purposely designed the sessions to be interactive, where there was an opportunity to listen, reassure, and respond to concerns. We also used this forum to test new ideas and initiatives and consult about key strategic directions and processes. The sessions became a bit of a working and walking together type approach, and we knew we wouldn't have buy-in if we didn't reach some form of consensus with our stakeholders. This is an example of a communication plan that we used during the preparation stages. We also used it to report to our executive. And concurrent to the staff information sessions, we launched targeted email campaigns providing detailed guidance to principal investigators and clinical trial staff on preparing for the upcoming short notice assessment and effectively using the audit tool. Over 250 emails were sent to clinical trial staff over a 3 to 5 day period, and the uptake of the tool soared afterwards, resulting in the highest usage to date. I just need to pay special mention to the clinical trial coordinators, and also to cheekily issue a safety alert to any health service who don't recognise that they are your most valuable asset in this process. They are your core group of people that will be your hands and feet on the ground when it comes to getting the key messages about the framework across to everyone in the clinical trial unit, especially investigators, who are typically the hardest group to reach. In our district, we invested in engaging with our coordinators for over a decade, and we drew heavily on this group to help lead implementation and training. One other thing I want to mention about communication is the language we adopted to simplify the complexity of the framework, to build confidence in our workforce and reduce stress. We explained to the clinical trial workforce the framework should be seen as an abridged version of the good clinical practice standards. As clinical trials already operate under strict GCP legislation, what we were saying is, look, you already know this, and you actually already are doing this. We just need you to think about it as a shortened GCP inspection, but with greater focus on consumer involvement, complaints management, and open disclosure. We coach staff on how to speak with assessors using language that we're already familiar with from their experiences with the sponsor monitoring and FDA and EMA inspections. So following the series of staff information sessions, the research support team then held weekly drop-in sessions so staff could be further supported and have specific questions answered. Frequently asked questions were generated after each drop-in session, and they were published onto the research intranet for everyone to access. All of our staff information sessions were recorded and available on the intranet. In 2015, we implemented the system REDCap across the SLHD as a way of supporting data management in research. We then used REDCap to build the Sydney Local Health District audit preparation tool to support the district-wide rollout and assist clinical trial staff prepare not only for the framework short notice accreditation assessments, but the TGA's Good Clinical Practice Inspection Program. The audit tool was created based on learnings from the pilot program at RPA, the guidance documents of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework and TGA Inspections Program, mock assessment outcomes, consultation with industry experts, and vigorous review conducted by our external GCP auditor. It was developed and piloted in facilities and departments for an audit. Units could ensure that they were audit ready by using the tool to conduct self-assessments. The tool encompasses a series of forms, checklists, guidance documents and links, support tools, action plan templates for areas requiring attention, GCP and other audit-ready training opportunities. A consultation process took place and it was approved by our peak Clinical Trial Steering Committee, and the use of the tool became a condition of SSA authorisation in 2023. The tool also provided value at the executive level, as they could access the information, and information could be granted to clinical governance teams, quality officers, and general managers. So here's a closer look at the tool. There are 3 sections. Section 1 is minimum data for accreditation. In this section, users complete mandatory fields that are essential to fulfil requirements of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework and the TGA Inspection Program. In Section 2, users begin working through the self-assessment section. The National Clinical Trials Governance Framework Accreditation Readiness Checklist form is the first section. And in Section 3, users then proceed and commence with the TGA GCP audit tool. This GCP audit tool is actually mandatory for clinical trials where the Sydney Local Health District is a sponsor. Now, I want to say there's still more work to do in this space, but we are very proud of this initiative. In my final slides, I'll briefly discuss Assessment Week, some practical tips, and taking care of your staff. Someone once told me, eagles need a lot of energy to fly, but when they hit the wind, they just breeze through the sky. I think this quote captures our experience quite well. Lots of energy needed before, and the calm required during the assessment. So during Assessment Week, it will require and demand long hours from you and your core support team. So here are some practical tips to survive it. Print out key documents the night before or beforehand to give to the assessor, such as any research in clinical trials, clinical governance framework documents, research governance policy, agenda and minutes of the governing body meetings, board attestation statements, and initiatives you wish to highlight. The other tip is stay connected with your clinical governance team and executive. You never know when an assessor may request to see board minutes or other executive documentation you are not privy to. Allocate 1 staff member to update the timetable, liaise with staff, and another to oversee additional documentation, and 1 staff member to sort out catering logistics. And the last point that I would say is take care of your core support staff who will work long hours with you. Ensure they are caffeinated, hydrated, and fed, and make sure they take breaks. So just a little bit about our experience with Assessment Week in 2024. Over a 1-week period in October of 2024, the Sydney Local Health District, including all facilities, health services, and 30 randomly selected clinical trials were assessed. We were given a rating of established system with no recommendations. In the final report, we were commended on many things. However, the ones I wish to highlight from the executive summary of the report, and which validated everything we worked hard for these past few years, are: documentation assessment was found to be of a high standard, there were effective clinical governance systems and processes, and there was a high level of engagement with consumers. Participants involved in clinical trials spoke very highly of their experience and interaction with staff. All the principal investigators were committed to improving the equity and enrolment of cultural and linguistically diverse participants in clinical trials, and outlined how this was being actioned. Clinical trial key performance measures are collected for us and indicate compliance well above the New South Wales expected performance target. Good clinical practice training is offered with a completion rate at 100%, and the Sydney Local Health District Research Audit Tool has been introduced to audit compliance with the framework. The audit tool was developed by the Sydney Local Health District and was a finalist in the 2024 New South Wales Health Research Administrative Awards. So I guess in my last slide, just some of the key takeaways and lessons and advice. What I would say is embed accreditation into everyday practice. It should not be a standalone process. Use the systems you already have to communicate and drive changes. People, culture, and structure matter. These are foundational. Keep messaging simple, repeat it often, and support your coordinators. They will carry the message further than any policy. And as I mentioned, there is so much I have not covered, but I hope you have found this useful. I am looking forward to your questions after this session, and thank you for allowing me to speak to you today.
Thank you, Merela. Some more great examples health services can use to prepare plans for assessment across all levels of the organisation. And it does emphasise the value of leadership at the governing body level to be able to effectively institute these plans and their role as an advocate in establishing a culture of clinical trials governance for the organisation. So this takes us to the end of our case studies for day 2 and to the Q&A component of today's webinar series. I will now pass over to my colleague Nicole Ward as our moderator to share some questions with presenters. Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks, Vanessa, and thanks to the speakers who've generously donated their time to be with us today for this Q&A. Unfortunately, Keith, who provided his perspective as an experienced assessor in yesterday's webinar, could not be with us today. However, we will be collating any questions received for him to inform our future webinars, updates and resources. So the first question today is for Stuart from Xavier Pacific Health, who shared his insights from assessment observation visits in yesterday's webinar. Stuart, from your observation visits, can you provide an example of an assessment that could be considered as exemplar? Can you describe the process and why it works so well, preferably with examples of actions undertaken by both the health service organisation and the assessor team? Thanks, Stuart.
Thanks, Nicole. Great question. Rather than pointing to a single assessment, I'd like to use a consolidated approach and draw on a few assessments which showcase different aspects of the assessment against the framework. So the first one I'd like to mention was an exemplar in terms of process. This involved a large southeastern Queensland health service, which was very good in terms of the engagement between the Research Governance Office and the assessor. So the assessor engaged early with the RGO and then went systematically through the action items, identifying at the outset the systems that were in place and used the opportunity not only to visually observe those systems in terms of accessibility and functionality, but then to look at the operational side, such as what staff were trained in the use. In this example, the RGO was very good in its preparation. They had a comprehensive gap analysis and they were able to support the assessor by walking them through the action item evidence points on a large shared screen. Once the systems were addressed, the assessment then moved on to review of clinical trials, and the RGO was just really transparent about areas of strength and limitations, which built trust and made the process more efficient. It was a good example of a health service and an assessor working together with quality improvement as a goal. The second example was an exemplar in terms of evidence acquisition, and this one comes from a regional New South Wales health service. Here the assessors use software to capture document references from plans, logs and minutes, and then use their iPads to take photos of the environment, including compliance tags and other aspects related to the safe environment action item. This file then provided a strong point of reference for associating evidence against maturity rating scales for each action item. It's just worth noting also just how efficient the assessors were. They knew the evidence needed for the action item, and once they had it, they moved on. The last example was an exemplar in terms of its review of clinical trials, and this was an assessment at a large metro service in Sydney, where the RGO enabled review of some of the trial documentation systematically, addressing some of the same aspects across the trial sampled. It was not only efficient, but it just saved time with the PI as well. In this scenario, a checklist was used, which was adopted and formed the backbone of the assessment. And it just meant that the assessor had, once they met with a PI, they're quite efficient, but then they could spend more time with a PI understanding, or their understanding of the framework requirements, and where the opportunity was available to meet with participants. The health service did an excellent job of facilitating this, and they made access to supporting documentation very easy. They also had the most comprehensive gap analysis that I've seen, and the health service escorted the assessor across the health service's large footprint, and in the process were providing additional pieces of information around the trial and the implementation process. It was just a really efficient process. So for the health service, the assessment really appeared to be a welcome culmination of many months of preparatory work where they could really just showcase their efforts.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Great examples, and I think really useful for both health service organisations and assessors. Thank you. So the next question is for Peter from the Townsville Hospital and Health Service. Peter, you said ensuring senior management are involved is an important step and key learning from your organisation's assessment. What advice can you give other organisations to help them engage and secure that executive governing body sort of buy-in and support? Thanks, Peter.
Look, we're fortunate. We've got an executive director who's an active ACHS assessor, and so we had buy-in to start with, and probably similar to the colleagues at the Sydney Local Health District. Good management buy-in really is important. This isn't something that one or two people lower in the organisation can carry on their own. I guess the first question to ask for those organisations that are not getting senior management buy-in is, does your service want to do trials? And I think there's good reasons why you would. It provides access to the latest treatments and medical opportunities for your patients. It provides important, interesting work for your staff, which will help to retain excellent staff. And it can provide a revenue stream which can help to reinvest in research. So all good reasons why you might want to do trials. If the answer to that is yes, we do want to do trials, then I think you've got to emphasise with your broader team that this is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a period of time to work through readiness. I think, as others have said, do a gap analysis early. Understand where your gaps are in meeting the framework, and then get an executive champion and give them something to do. Get them involved, actively engaged in that process. So the things that the senior people might want to be involved in is establishing the governance structures, the committee structures, to make sure that there's appropriate reporting through to board level. Championing policy and procedural development so that you've got somebody with some weight coming behind the work being done to help push that through the system. And I think also engage them to work with their networks, because I think it was pointed out before, health services are generally pretty happy to share what they've done, share policies, share systems, share learnings. And so we don't all have to start from scratch. And I think if we can link in well, and senior people are well linked to strong networks throughout the country, then a lot of benefit can be brought in. That means that not everybody having to start from day one. But that's about it. I think it's not rocket science. I think if you do want to be involved in it, there are good reasons to be involved in it. And there's just it's a process to work through. I don't think there's a whole lot of shortcuts. Certainly, it's not something that a manager can say today, I want this to happen next week. Go and make it happen. It's not going to happen in a week. So allow time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's great advice, Peter. Thank you. The next question is for Mel from the Australian Teletrial program. Mel, you talked about how you created evidence lists for hospital and health services in Queensland to help them prepare for accreditation to the governance framework. Can you elaborate on how they were created, what steps were taken and resources used to develop them? And also just noting the differences in clinical trial service delivery between primary and satellite sites in that decentralised clinical trial model. Can these evidence lists be tailored to different sites for a more proportional approach to assessment to the governance framework? Thanks, Mel.
Hi, Nicole. Sorry, I will just give a disclaimer that I'm off sick waiting for wrist surgery at the moment. So I just wanted to listen to everything today. Can you just repeat part of the question again, and I'll attempt to answer because I'm just was struggling to get my unmute off.
Look, I'm sorry to hear that, Mel. I hope you're okay. We're just asking about your evidence list that you created for hospitals and health services in Queensland, and just if you're able to elaborate a bit more on how you went about creating them, the steps you took and the resources, and if they can be tailored for specific sites. Just to share, in case other health service organisations would like to do something similar, if you're able, Mel. Thanks.
That's fine, and some of that does relate to the Townsville Hospital and Health Service, because even as a Queensland statewide team, we are hosted in that hospital and health service. So part of the work that I'd started when I was a trials manager there in oncology, we were a pilot site for the NCTGF, just like Sydney were. And that was, I think, prior to Peter coming. But we'd had that opportunity as a pilot site in Townsville to start looking at how we were gathering evidence. At that time, we had a really experienced governance officer as well in Townsville. So we were very fortunate, like we have been, in having Peter. That was able to help us to construct those evidence lists, and it was a really large Excel spreadsheet. I remember the amount of time it took to gather the evidence at that point in time. And from that really came those lists that were very kind of much more initial in the beginning, but that I was able to use when I came into the statewide leader role to be able to make them able to be used across, and really have a look at each action item of standard 1 and standard 2 and say, if you haven't got anything, so if your action 1.1 is you're a really trial naive site, the first question I think is, do you have any kind of working group or research kind of committee in your facility already, in your organisation? And if the answer is no, a bit similar to what someone else was saying, is then go and set up your working groups. Now, in Sydney, that would be much more at an established level, and they were looking from that higher level because they already had existing infrastructure and processes in place. But for a trials naive site, and this is why we need that kind of proportional review, they are really starting at the very beginning of what do we actually have in place? Do we conduct any research in the organisation? Are we conducting clinical trials for the first time? And if we are, well, what is the starting point? So I think for those really naive sites, they'll be looking at those initial points, and then we just grouped growing and established together, because if you're doing clinical trials to a level where you're going to be assessed as growing, if you've got the right management supports in place in your organisation, you're quickly going to become established, and the potential is there. So I think, look, I think they do help both the growing and established. And as I said, I've worked with some of the leads in Victoria, and we've shared across resourcing so that we're not all doing the same thing as well. And when Merela spoke and I saw what they'd done, I think, the Commission bringing the ones of us together from the pilot and from organisations that have been accredited to say, what are the most useful tools and what should we be using? And could we put a repository somewhere so that people know what to use? Would be really helpful for everybody in the sector. But for us in Queensland, it's just to say to those very initial sites, for us to be able to work with them as well, a bit like an action plan. So yes, it's a cheat sheet, if you like, and it's a guide for each step, each action of the standard. But it's also what evidence might you start to bring together, because you might already have something. You've got patient and quality systems in your healthcare facilities. You've got a level of clinical governance. You've got clinicians that are already working, and all that needs to be part of it. That's why clinical trials cannot be something other than normal clinical care and have to be assessed, and the sites that are preparing for accreditation have to do so alongside all of their existing systems for patient reporting, open disclosure, as well as bringing clinical trials into it. But we really wanted, because in Queensland we've done quite a number of clinical trials, and even, we've got clinical trial activity via teletrials in the most remote hospital and health services. We had to use that kind of those processes to have a look at what did they already have and start to guide the organisations as to what they could start to prepare.
Thanks, Mel. Great answer, and thanks for sharing some more insights into that, great tool you've developed. And please take care, especially extra appreciation for you being with us today. I hope all goes well with you. Our next question is for Jhodie from the Latrobe Regional Health. Jhodie, in your presentation, you stated that the Gippsland Clinical Trial Network can help support more immature sites develop capacity for clinical trial service delivery from shared learnings from sites who may have already undergone assessment to the governance framework. Can you elaborate on how these shared learnings are communicated through the network? What processes are in place to ensure that these important sort of shared learnings are reaching the relevant sites? And just as well, how might this approach help to address the considerations you mentioned regarding the implementation of the governance framework being quite resource intensive and potentially impacting the capacity of new and emerging sites to deliver clinical trials? Thanks, Jhodie.
Thanks, Nicole. I think Peter's presentation really quite nicely illustrated how the equity side of it can sometimes be overshadowed by the quantity of work that might be the vision put in front of people in regard to the framework. And I think the framework provides a really great opportunity to facilitate improvements and embedding trial activities into routine standard healthcare practice. And it's really about those opportunities. But when you've got smaller sites, from our experiences, when you've got smaller, potentially immature sites, you're approaching clinical trials, and we all work in clinical trials, it's a whole nother language. You're trying to implement that into your current care practice, and then on top of that, there's this framework. And if you don't know what you don't know, so this framework looks like Mount Everest. So the hope is that by developing a network, for example, what we're trying to work on in Gippsland is, can we come together collectively? So we've got smaller sites, or that we take the strengths from the sites that we do have that have gone through experiences and help that to mentor and support the sites that are really looking at this uphill, what they think is an uphill battle. You know, our smaller sites, for example, in Gippsland, and I'm sure it's even worse, you know, in more remote settings, the same person wears multiple hats. So quite often what we've experienced ourselves in some of the mentoring programs and the opportunities with metro sites is they're like, well, our X person does this and our X person does that, and we've got that, and we've got beautiful examples today of some beautiful opportunities and guides. But in smaller settings, this is one person going, oh my goodness, where do I even start? So we're trying to develop this opportunity where we can develop central repositories, where we can share documents, share learnings, have meetings. And if you start as a collective group going, it's achievable, we can break it down, how do we think forward and go, if in the next year you want to really start engaging in trial activity, what's our first step? Well, the gap analysis. And even to say that to a smaller site, they're, so you go, okay, break it down. How are we going to get your exec engaged? Well, this is what we did. Would that work for your site? Could we reach out to a metro site? So it's really about a mentoring, a sharing, an upskilling to gain confidence, so the framework's not seen as a barrier that's going to limit people engaging and going forward in the clinical trial space.
Thanks, Jhodie. A fantastic initiative for positive impact, you know, on health equity for people in regional and remote areas, and for implementing the governance framework. So the next question, or the last question, will be for Merela from the Sydney Local Health District. Merela, you mentioned you leverage key existing forums that had long been established in your organisation to scale up and prepare for assessment to the governance framework. In what way did you leverage them, and how did this impact your preparation and readiness for assessment? Thanks.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you for all the presentations. That was incredible. And yes, I know that, you know, from a large metropolitan hospital, you think we've got long established systems, but our biggest challenge was size and scalability and consistency and getting that message. And yes, you know, we were in the current FTE, but yeah, it constantly feels like you're just kind of this one person amongst this Mount Everest as well. So I share in the struggle. So I guess there were many forums that we leveraged off, but I'm just going to talk about 3 main ones and then just briefly about the others. So these were obviously existing forums that had been in place for 10 years. We have a very strong governance structure within the Sydney Local Health District, and within our board we have a number of subcommittee of the board that focus on key things. So we have a subcommittee of the Board of Education and Research, and we quickly identified that that was going to be the governing body. So, and that's made up of executives and stakeholders and managers and directors and people from different backgrounds that could really provide us with feedback. And so we used that forum to really prepare our executive to endorse the framework and to actually report on progress. The second one was, which is probably kind of like, it's like the engine room kind of forum, and that is our district's clinical trial steering committee, which is chaired by Professor David Cook, and he's on the line here at the moment. And this is the steering committee that actually reports up to the subcommittee of the board. We try to make sure that all of the key groups and forums have some kind of reporting line up and reporting back down. And so this is a group that's made up of really senior and clinical trial stakeholders and people from different parts of the organisation, like HR, IT, finance, just that kind of core operational people that we can just kind of get together and make, these decisions. And this was kind of that group that we were able to make district-wide, we were able to make decisions for district-wide implementation. And the third forum, which is my favourite, and I say this in my presentation, is we had established a coordinators network meeting back in, I think, late 2014. And this is a bi-monthly group where we get all of our coordinators, research coordinators, clinical trial coordinators, anyone that provides some kind of operational support for research. And it is chaired and managed by our incredible network manager, who also developed this wonderful timetable for the assessor and also the checklist for the assessor during assessment week. And this is really this kind of network meeting, or the bi-monthly, where the ideas are tabled, exchange of ideas. It's a real kind of forum to share and learn and to really impart all different types of learnings and processes. And it's a way for these coordinators to really actually build relationships with one another and across facilities. So these meetings became so pivotal and core during our preparations. We recorded all of our sessions and they were on our intranet. And then some of the other forums that we leveraged were some of the Clinical and Quality Council meetings, the risk management committees, our Aboriginal Health Steering Group, Consumer Advisory, and some of the divisions of medicine meeting. And we use those forums to just really give presentations and understanding, because there's like, what is this all about, and what does this mean for us? So they did become the key platforms to disseminate updates. We prepare the workforce and the organisation to assign responsibility, very, very much so seeking feedback, and really to develop and cultivate a culture of shared decision making. So yeah, I believe that these forums really did contribute significantly to our overall readiness. It really did improve staff awareness. It reduced the need to create new forums, which I do understand that some services don't have anything, so you do need to create them from scratch. But we just didn't want to, create new forums because no one wants to attend another meeting, right? So, and so what we did with those kind of forums is we updated those terms of reference. We embedded the National Clinical Trials Governance in those core functions of those groups to actually, solidify, responsibilities going forward. And we found that we had more consistent practice. So I think the final thoughts I'd say about this is that there will be many forums that you'll need to leverage off. And with the size of our health precinct, let me tell you, we were finding out more forums as we were going. So I was like, oh, did you know about this or that? So it was about trying to identify all of them and get to them. So, and again, many of you have said this, is seeking constant feedback. And, I have to say some of the best feedback and the most beneficial is going to be the ones that you probably don't want to hear, So, and that's okay. And, small steps, don't create something big. I always say to my team, start somewhere and just keep moving and improving. So thank you. Sorry, so
Thanks,
far.
Merela.
Yeah.
No, that's great advice. Yeah, thank you. And definitely, an example of exemplar practice in preparing for assessment. So thanks for sharing that. Yes, that does conclude the Q&A session. We have gone a little bit over time, but that's okay. Any questions that we might have received from attendees throughout this, the webinars and the Q&A, we will be collecting them and we will be addressing those in future webinars and resources. So thank you once again to all our wonderful guests for being with us today and sharing your valuable insights. And thanks, Vanessa.
Thank you, Nicole. So this brings us to the end of our April webinar. Thank you to everyone who has joined online and to our wonderful speakers for generously donating their time across the series to share their experiences with you all. As I mentioned, these webinars are being recorded and will be published on our website. And an EDM will be released shortly to advise when these videos are available, along with a feedback survey. And we'll be grateful if you can spare the time to complete it, as it will guide the content of future webinars the team will deliver across the year. Thank you, everyone.